tell us about the person, Pat. Tell us about, your earliest memory of him. What's your first memory of him?
Well, so I went to college in Washington, D.C., and uh, I had a classmate from high school who went to the Naval Academy, and he had written to me, because of course nobody texted or emailed back then, and asked me if I would want to go to a Navy pit game with some of his friends at the academy. But, in those days, I don't know if things have changed or not, fourth classmen, which were freshmen, couldn't sit with any of their dates. They had to sit with their companies in a separate part of the stadium. So I took a friend of mine from college, and we were to meet these guys afterwards, after the game. And behind me sat a first classman, which is a senior at the Naval Academy, and his name was Bob Light. And we started talking, and he asked for my number, so I gave it to him. And he wrote to me for a while. And then, I guess in maybe December, or late December, early January of 1966, 65, 66, I got a letter from this other guy from the Naval Academy, and he said, well, I'm going to be the bearer of bad news, but I hope that means something to you ultimately. But Bob went home and got engaged to his high school sweetheart over the break. But he said, I'm not engaged, and I don't have a high school sweetheart, and I'd like to be in touch with you. And that's how it started. And I went to the Naval Academy, and the moment I met him, I was just, there was nothing negative about him. He was full of life. He was intelligent. He was a lot of fun. He made you laugh all the time. He was just, and from then on, we just hit it off, and we stayed together. By staying together, he obviously graduated. One of those pictures I sent you was at his graduation. That was me with him. And he went, to Kingsville, Texas, and Pensacola, Florida. He was stationed in all those places. And I was still in college. So if he'd get leave, his family lived in Virginia, Northern Virginia. They were close to Washington, D.C. He would have to split his leave between coming to see me and seeing his family. And, he didn't get a lot of leave. So we corresponded a lot by letter, phone on occasion, but, it was expensive back then to call and stay on the phone for any length of time. And, he would come home whenever he could, and I would meet him. He'd come to my house, and that went on for, pretty much of the 3 years that we had while he was going through flight training.
You said that that he did not want to get married until he came back from Vietnam.
Right, from this one cruise. This was his first cruise. He was going to go on a second one if we were still involved in the Vietnam conflict. He would have gone back 4 months after he came home. So I think his feeling, at least what he conveyed to me, was that he was unsure of what it was going to be like. And he was not, he was impulsive in some ways, but things about his future and his life, he was cautious about. And I think he felt, I don't know what I'm going to be facing when I go over there. I've been told that there's usually 2 to 3 fatalities on every cruise of pilots. And I just want to know that one of them's not going to be me. And when I come back and I feel like, okay, I know what happens over there, I know what goes on, now I feel comfortable getting married. But I think he talked a lot about maybe not coming back. And then he started to write about them sending him on missions. He was a reconnaissance pilot. So in essence, he flew a spy plane. And he didn't have any ammunition on board. Reconnaissance planes didn't. So they were always escorted by a fighter plane to protect them. But they would go in and take the pictures after whatever, fighting or bombing occurred. And that's what he did. But I feel like he almost had a premonition, maybe, that something bad might happen to him. And of course, when he told his father that he was going into, flying and becoming a Navy pilot, his father had said to him, "You know what they call Navy pilots, don't you?" And his aunt, he said, "Dead." But Pat loved to fly. He was an excellent pilot. He used to fly in when he got his pilot's license to a field here in New York, not far from where I live, and I used to drive and pick him up. He'd leave the plane there, and then when his leave was up, I'd bring him back. He'd get in the plane and fly back to whatever base he took off from.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess I could say this was a choice he made, and he died doing something he loved. But I think it's the unknown. Like, how can somebody disappear like that and nobody know? It didn't make any sense to me. And in his letters, when I would voice these concerns, he'd say, well, there are a whole bunch of ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. I mean, it's not like we're the only ship there. So I thought about that, and I thought, well, if there are all these ships, why didn't nobody see them? It wasn't nighttime. It was broad daylight. That always has bothered me. And I think I've been looking for an answer to those questions that I don't seem to get,
Are you confident that the plane went down in the Gulf of Tonkin and
No,
not over land?
no. I'm not confident that what they said happened to him really happened. I mean, his escort was right next to him. He dropped down to refuel, and within those few minutes, he disappeared. So where did he go without anybody seeing him? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
How did you say that Pat's dad didn't like him, going to Vietnam? And was that, so far as you remember, was that just fear, concern for his son's safety, or was it also partly related to a question about Vietnam itself? And do you remember that being a topic? Like, what is this war about? Because let me see, Pat went missing, if I have it right, in 1969, December 1969, pretty late in the conflict. Of course, by that time, there's been a lot of division and so on. Do you remember having a sense of what Pat himself thought about the situation in Vietnam?
I think his feel, and I was not a protester of any sort. I didn't get that involved in politics when all those protests were going on.
Yeah.
I didn't know enough, and I had a fiance fighting this war, so I really had no right to be protesting it.
Sure.
While he was putting his life on the line.
Yeah.
But I think his attitude, if I could remember correctly, was that, look, he originally did not want to go to the Naval Academy. That was not his first choice. He had gotten into Georgia Tech, and I think he wanted to go there. But his brother had gone, his father had gone. It was free if you got in.
Yeah.
And I mean, I didn't know him when he made that decision as to going along with his family's tradition of graduating from the Naval Academy.
Yeah.
but my feeling was that he was kind of matter of fact. This is what I have to do. I don't think he strongly felt necessarily that we should have been in Vietnam. I never got that feeling from him, like, oh, this is where we're supposed to be. I think his attitude was more, I got my education, I got all this training, this is going to help me in the future, I'm going to do the right thing.
Sure. Now, you said a minute ago that he had an escort with him,
Mm-hmm.
and then you say that Pat dropped down to refuel, so there was a refueling plane as well?
Yes, there was a tankard, and Pat did. The reconnaissance plane held more fuel, from what I understand, but the fighter jets had to refuel often. So they came back from a mission. They were over the Gulf of Tonkin, about 7 miles from the aircraft carrier where the tanker that refueled the jets was in the air. So they changed positions. Pat would normally fly in front, and the fighter escort would fly a little bit behind him as a protection. Pat was having trouble receiving instructions on his radio at the time that his fighter pilot said. So he signaled him that he was going to refuel. So Pat switched positions with him in a loose kind of waiting position while the fighter refueled. So he had to drop down from where they were in order to hook up to the tanker,
Yeah.
the fighter pilot. And within the time he dropped down to hook up, the guy on the tanker said, where's the reconnaissance pilot? And that's when he tried to reach him and got no answer. Now, I should add that Pat still had about an hour and a half worth of fuel. So the theory was, one of the theories was, that he could have gone anywhere. He could have headed over to North Vietnam and crashed on the land there or landed there. He could have gone over to China, and there's an island there. I can't remember the name of it right now, but that was another theory, that he could have landed there or crash landed there.
So is the thought then that when he dropped down, he's having trouble communicating, and maybe he just lost contact with those other planes and then just kind of got lost or something? Or is...
Well, I don't know. I mean, he was 7 miles from the aircraft carrier. There were other ships there along with the aircraft carrier. I would have imagined, I know they lost him on radar on the Hancock, which was the carrier he was on.
Yeah.
He dropped out of the radar screen. But there were other ships. So my question is, well, if he was still flying, wouldn't one of those other ships have picked him up on their radar screens? But see, I don't know that any of that was ever investigated. From my knowledge, from what I was told, they searched for 2 or 3 days after he was reported missing, and then that was the end of it.
Are you aware of, I mean, there must have been reports written about this. Have you read the reports written at the time? I'm thinking there must have been reports from the other pilots written. There must have been something written down.
Well,
are you aware of any of that? Or
the only pilot that he was with at the time was the fighter pilot, and I spoke to him. He's passed away since then, but I did speak to him, and he told me the same story that the captain of the ship had written. Same story I just told you. There were no other pilots that I know of that were in the air at that time. But there were other ships there. And just recently, someone that was investigating this case had said there appeared to have been somebody on someone else's radar on one of the other ships. It was a garbled message that could not be deciphered at that time. And they were going to look into whether or not that garbled message came from Pat.
Wow.
The other thought was that in those days, the oxygen masks that they wore were very uncomfortable. So if you were at a certain altitude, you knew you could remove it for a few minutes. But if there was something wrong with the plane and the dials weren't giving him the right information, then he could possibly have taken off that oxygen mask when he shouldn't have been taking it off, because he wasn't at the right altitude, and he could have passed out. So hypoxia was another thought, that he passed out, he would fall forward, pushing in the wheel of the plane, which would then make the plane go downward into the water.
Yeah.
But then again, wouldn't that have left some debris?
Yeah.
And this one pilot that I spoke to said it's very unusual when it doesn't, but depending on the speed and the angle of the plane when it hits the water, it is a possibility that the plane could have gone down intact without breaking apart. So that's all the information we've ever had.
Yeah.
He was declared without any further investigation, without any further information, at least not to his family or us, that they changed his status from missing in action 2 years later in 1971 to killed in action, body not recovered. And his brother had written at that time, but I don't believe his brother ever got an answer. But he did write and say, is there new information that we're not aware of? Why did you change my brother's status? And his brother, I don't believe, ever got an answer.
What is the last thing you mentioned getting letters from Pat? What's the last thing you heard from him?
So Pat hated to write. He wasn't the best speller in the world, which is ironic because he was brilliant. But spelling, he thought words should be spelled just the way they sounded and not necessarily the way they were supposed to be spelled. So as a result, he said one time to me, I hope that we know each other well enough so I don't have to take out my dictionary for every single word I write to you. So it was a known thing that writing was not something he loved to do, but there was really no other alternative. Right. And when he went to Vietnam, I would get 3 letters a week from him on average, which was unusual. He would prefer to call, even though it would cost him a lot of money, than write if he could get away with it when he was stationed in those various places. I have a lot of letters from him, but I've got a ton of letters that he wrote to me from the ship. And I was used to getting at least 3 letters a week from him. And 2 weeks before he was reported missing, I got nothing. No letters, not a word from him. Now, it was close to Christmas. He told me that 2 of the reconnaissance pilots, there were only 4 of them. One was on R&R, and the other one had a double ear infection. So, of course, if you have an ear infection, you can't fly. So he said he was doing double the amount of flying that he would normally do, given those 2 pilots were unavailable. So I figured that he was probably so busy that he didn't have time to write. And the last letter I got from him was dated December 1st. He disappeared December 16th.
what you, maybe you've already recounted it. I mean, is that the letter you found out that he was going to be very, very busy because these other two pilots were out? Was that basically the content of that?
No, no, that letter didn't mention it at all. The letter was kind of short for him because he did go on and on and on about, I used to say to him, I think I could get my pilot's license, because he would tell me everything about how to fly a plane, how to land on an aircraft carrier, how to take off from an aircraft. He would just go on and on and on. He'd draw me diagrams. I said, well, I'm sure I could pass that test now. But no, oddly enough, this was a short letter. And he didn't mention anything about that. In fact, it was almost kind of bland for him, like he used to talk about everything, and this was just like, oh, I better write to her. It's been, I haven't written to her in the last day or two. Maybe I just should send her off a letter. But it wasn't his typical letter that I had been getting. But then again, he had written about the other two pilots, and one of the pilots was his bunkmate. And he had written to me after Pat disappeared. He came home back early from R&R, and he just did everything he could to find out what happened to Pat, to no avail, and he was very frustrated. He came back home and he drank himself to death. And his marriage dissolved prior to that. He got remarried. I spoke to his second wife, and she said, when he used to drink, he used to always talk about Pat and start to cry. And she said, I always thought it was a girl that he had known, and she said, and now you're telling me it was his bunkmate, because she said he never spoke about what happened on that cruise. He never would talk about it. He never mentioned it. But he was in touch with me while he was on the ship, and he said to me, Pat kept all your letters. I don't know why. I was like, well, you're a romantic, aren't you? He said, but I'm supposed to pack up all his effects and send them back to his parents. He said, what do you want me to do with the letters? And I said, just throw them overboard.
No. And
so I guess that's what he did. Yeah.
So those letters are gone.
The letters from him that I have are not. I kept them, but the letters that I wrote to him, I mean, in retrospect, I probably should have asked him to send them to me, but at that point, I didn't know if he was still alive. I didn't know if he was coming. I just, my decision-making ability at that point was not at its best. Let's put it that way. And all I could think of is just get rid of the letters. I don't think his parents want to go through our love letters. I don't think that's necessary. And I guess I didn't want to burden him additionally. He had to take care of all of Pat's stuff, and then he'd have to send all those letters back to me. And it just, I don't know. I just told him to get rid of them, and I guess he did.
So how did the news come to you?
Well, interestingly enough, I was, it was December. I was taking some graduate courses. I had finished college in 1969, and I was taking some graduate courses and working. And I was working during the day, and I was going to graduate school at night, so I didn't get home until like 11 o'clock usually. And I had a younger sister. I have a younger sister. She's not so young anymore, but she's younger than I am. And she was 9 at the time, 9 or 10. And she was home with my father. My mother was out. She was also at work. And my sister told me, years later, I got a phone call from this guy that was telling me about Pat, and he was asking for you. And I told him, I'm her sister, she's not home. And he gave me the message that Pat was missing. And she said, I went in and I told Daddy, and Daddy said, don't say anything to your sister until your mother comes home. If she comes home before your mother, don't say anything. But years later, my sister was like, I have to wonder why this guy would tell a 9-year-old. And I to this day don't know who that was. But Pat's mother knew he was dating me. She did not know we had gotten engaged because he wanted to tell his parents when he came home from the cruise, when we would all be together. So they didn't know that, but his mother knew he was dating me. So she told his sister, I think she's a significant person in his life. We need to get in touch with her. And he had an address book with my name and number in it. So they called me before I got home. My mother had gotten home before me, and my father told my mother. And my mother got the call and said when I got in, I would call back. And then I came home and she told me.
Mm.
Yeah. And we called his parents, and they asked me to come down and spend Christmas with them that year, which I did. Because at that point, I think there was a lot of hope. I know his mother had hope that he was missing because there was no evidence of anything else at that point. And I spent Christmas with them and stayed with them for a while. And then one day I said to his mother, if something happened to him, I don't know how I'm going to go on without him. I said, we had this whole future ahead of us. And she said to me, you'll go on because you have to, but I'll never replace my son.
Mm. Yeah.
So I was just, I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't know how to make things better. I didn't know how to make things happen that would let us find out what happened to him out there and give us some kind of, I hate to use the word closure. It's really overused, but it's the only word that comes up that I can think of right now. Just let us know what happened to him. That's all. Not that he just disappeared, but let us know what the circumstances were.
Yeah.
And she went on, I have kept in touch with the family. It was too painful after I married. His mother understood, don't get me wrong, but I don't think she was able to be in touch with me again after I married someone else, because I think that was like, her feeling, I think, was she gave up on my son,
Mm.
And she would continue to send packages through the Red Cross, because you were allowed to send one a year, and she would send one, and it would always come back.
Mm.
Yeah.
You say that in the article that you sent me, it's mentioned here that when the POWs eventually returned home, then you realized he wasn't among them. I mean, was that something you were actively paying attention to when, right at the end of the war, when those POWs?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, because we didn't know where he went. I mean, he could have very well gone back to land. He wasn't that far from it. He had the gasoline on his plane to do it. He might have gone back and been captured.
So were you then, watching the news and
Oh,
looking
yeah.
for him?
Oh, yeah.
The guys,
Oh,
the POWs
yeah.
are coming off the plane, and
Yeah. Yeah.
you've been to the Vietnam Memorial in DC?
Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Have you been there multiple times?
Well, I think it was 2009, his Pat's brother and sisters decided to have a memorial service for him because there never was any. His parents kept waiting for his remains or him to be returned. His sisters and brother were getting married and having children during those years. And every time his one sister, Kathleen, would talk to the parents about doing something, his mother just she said, I just can't. So nothing was ever done. There was no memorial service or anything like that. I think they planted a tree somewhere in his name, but I think that was it. So I guess a lot of people that Pat flew with, a lot of his Naval Academy classmates, wanted to start a scholarship in his name. And so his two sisters and brother decided it was time to have a memorial service for him. So they did. And they had it at the officers' club in, I believe, somewhere in Virginia. And they had a monument, erected for him, and the caisson. And then we went for the reception, and a lot of his classmates came and people spoke. I went then, and then I've been back a couple of times with his sister, his one sister, and then I've been there with my daughter.
Yeah. What was the reason I ask about multiple times is, as you know, is such a powerful place, and I imagine it's much more powerful for someone who actually, has a personal connection to one of the names on the wall. What was that like for you, that first time when you saw Pat's name on the wall there?
Well, I broke down in tears, and I felt what a waste of such a dynamic individual. What a terrible waste. And how sad is it that I'm probably not the only one that feels this way about losing someone that meant so much to so many people. And it did. It's colored so many lives, not just mine, his parents, his siblings, I would say even his nieces and nephews who heard about him and think about him, and they've never met him. His shipmate, I've heard from the guy that was on the flight deck when Pat took off, and he said, I waited there and he never came back, and he said, that's haunted me all these years.
Let's just say, for the sake of conversation, that Pat's listening, and what would you say to him if you were certain you had his ear for a minute? What would you say?
Why didn't you marry me before you went over there? You might have been saved. They might not have sent you on the more dangerous missions. They might have spread it out a little bit more, and maybe if that's what you were doing, maybe that could have saved you. And, what a wonderful life we would have had if we had had the chance.
Yeah.
I've been very blessed. I'm very grateful for what I do have, but I can't lose those feelings of the one person I don't have.
I hear you. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the time you've taken, Darlene. It's it's been for me, it's been very powerful listening to you, and I wish there was more I could say. Then I very much hope that this case can be resolved, and we'll do our part to make this public and to spread the word. Thank you very much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope this gets out there, and I hope somebody listens and wants to try to, you know, put the manpower in to maybe just solve a little bit, even a little bit, I take, of this mystery about what happened to my fiance.
Mm, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.